Can you guys hear me okay? Oh, fantastic. Okay, so thank you very much for taking the time to spend the next half an hour with me. I feel quite uncomfortable kind of standing on the stage, actually. But so I woke up at 4:30 this morning. Some of you that know me know that I'm generally an early bird. But I kind of woke up and thought, well, what qualifies me to be able to stand in front of you guys talking about supply chain transformation? Because all of us, as part of our daily lives, experience transformation of some sort. But I think there's two key reasons. The first one is that probably like most of us, I'm absolutely passionate about the value supply chain can bring into the ecosystem of the businesses that we work in. And I also recognize that the role that we play and the transformation we try to drive is not easy to deliver. And we see a lot of success, but equally, I'm sure all of us have seen some spectacular failures, myself included. And for me, this gave us an opportunity for us collectively to be able to help share some of the ingredients which really help us be successful, but also some of the pitfalls to avoid. And for me personally, for the last 12 years, I've been predominantly driving transformation in complex and in sometimes quite immature supply chains, and across CPG, across retail, in industrial, across different operating models and different ownership models with value chains with different levels of maturity. And if I'm able to maybe help share some of the things which in retrospect I wouldn't do again, and they stick in your mind, then for me that's a real success for today. So I think in terms of what I really want us to achieve today is not for me to stand up here doing lots of talking. So I'm sure I will do some, but I'd really encourage if anyone has any questions, anyone has got any provocation that they want to bring to the discussion, we'll leave time for Q&As at the end, but I really encourage you to shout out as we go, because I think that will make the quality of the discussion so much richer. But what I'd really like to share is there are kind of 8 core elements and considerations which, as part of the transformation programs I drive now, are always front of mind for me. And these may not be applicable to all of your businesses, but if 1 or 2 of these are, it's really worthwhile just thinking about how you embed those within your transformation programs. Both the building of those programs, but especially in the execution. Because like it or not, as we discussed this morning, there are 2 key areas in which our transformations need to be able to deliver. The first one is value. We talked about that this morning, and it was quite a nice kind of segue into my session earlier on. But if you're doing a transformation program just for the sake of a transformation program, what's the point? And I'm sure all of us have experienced some level of change which has delivered absolutely no value at all, and in some cases has actually eroded value. And I'd really encourage all of us to think about value creation, but especially how do you deliver that in your business ecosystem? Or supply chains are remarkably similar. I think we all know that's the case. But how they are deployed in businesses and how they are deployed in both your supply chain ecosystem, but the broader ecosystem which sits around it is where value is delivered. And when you think about value, it's thinking about not just cost. I think we all have a passion about how do we reduce cost to serve. We wouldn't be here if we didn't. But for me, it's far more than that. It's about revenue. How do we drive incremental revenue? How do we drive enhanced margin? How do we drive EBIT? But also, how do we unlock more value from our cash? And how do you do that? Not in the ecosystem you have now, but really think about the ecosystem that you have in the future. So maybe give maybe a couple of examples. In my business, and I was speaking to some people about this yesterday, I've got 190 factories, and which are very localized operating models. So, one of the opportunities we've got is trying to centralize, some of the activity which we do within the value chain. Now, I could go and look at the P&Gs of this world and think, how can I go and learn from P&G, which is hugely centralized, but actually that would be completely inappropriate for my model. You know, my ecosystem is so fundamentally different to P&G that I will see some benefits, but I really won't be able to realize them. But there are other businesses, you know, in my experience in retail, where actually there's huge benefit in understanding, you know, when businesses went from store to centralized replenishment in terms of the learnings they had and how I can apply that to my business. So really, really think about what is the value you want to create, but secondly, what are the value drivers in your ecosystem? And throughout all of the building and the execution of this, keep coming back to that mantra, because there's nothing worse than sitting at the end or having a transformation program handed to you, and you think, what's this actually delivered? Well, not a lot, really. So I don't know if that resonates with people in the room. And I think this is especially important when you start talking about system implementations and the benefits that comes with, you know, a lot of digital innovation. You know, how is that going to deliver in your ecosystem? But on top of that, I think in terms of how you take that foundation and then turn that into the solutions which deliver value, what I've really learned is that there are two elements which underpin that. The first one is very few supply chain transformation programs are truly innovative. Generally, somebody else has done it. And quite often, it's been done in your own business, but you just don't know it. You know, so the question which I'd ask all of you to consider is, how do you consider and how do you learn from best practice which is applicable to your ecosystem? But then how do you do that in solutions which are practical, you know, and drive value at the point of impact? You know, I've seen many initiatives, and I've stopped initiatives, and I've mistakenly continued with them, which are quite theoretical, you know, like a textbook. You know, this sounds great in principle. I'm doing an S&OP program. Why? Because everybody else has got it. You know, but it's really thinking about what are the practical solutions that drive at the point of action. And how do you know your business so you know what those value drivers are? You know, where is value created? Where is it eroded? And how do you know the business all the way to the people who sit in your warehouses, in your transport operations, your 3PLs, in your factories? You know where you can unlock that. And for me, I think this is something which, if you can get this right, it supercharges your plan. If you get it wrong, the value which you'll create will just be eroded straight away. So I don't know if anyone, you know, and maybe I go out to the room, whether anyone has really had an experience where, you know, they've either really taken that best practice and applied it into their operation, you know, and really seen success, you know, where people have seen, you know, actually, given the opportunity, you know, given the experience I've had, I would have done things differently. I don't know if anybody? I'm sure somebody has. Yeah.
So in a previous business, yeah, sure. So those of you may not have caught that. So when I was working at Ecolab, which is a chemical manufacturer, I was given the challenge of, we had 7 billion total delivered cost, and to what you was talking about, Ben, there, I was given the challenge to find 1 billion, take 1 billion out over 3 years. I was thinking, my goodness, how am I going to do this? And it was really surprising for me, for all the systems, all the innovation, people in the supply chain delivered the change. And we really went around, not to call it innovation, but basic principles. So we followed, we talked about it a little bit last night, basic lean principles around loss analysis, where was the biggest bang for the buck. But actually what we did, we opened up huge amounts of opportunity to improve safety, improve quality. We had 1,500 associates that would, they used to call it, my name's Alex Johns, by the way, but they used to call it OWL TV. So I'd do like a 5-10 minute video update, post it out 3 times a week, get the engagement, and then we'd have market stall events. So everyone globally knew about market stall events and would then present what they were doing. And it really became quite energized, even though it wasn't necessarily a system change, but it was a true transformation change that everyone got involved in because they're excited about helping me and helping the business and helping themselves to make the supply chain work easier. So yeah, that was a success story, but I've had some not so good stories, but I'll let someone else share those.
Now, I don't know if anyone's got an example of, a transformation which you've driven which hasn't delivered, what you wanted it to do, and how you then adapted to that.
It's a challenge, but we haven't adapted to. It's just a problem. So I'm hearing a lot about metrics and especially financial targets. So we centralized procurement into 2 service centers, one in India, one in Mexico. Productivity, headcount, cost savings. What it has created, or something that we didn't put into the business case and we've lost, is the knowledge, and that's had an impact on sourcing. So we're making some wrong sourcing decisions. So I'm just trying to think about how, in these business justifications, in these transformation projects, headcount reduction, productivity benefits, savings, COGS, there's a lot of quantitative things, but how do you measure things like the qualitative, so the sourcing decisions, how do you measure those things?
I think it's really interesting because I've experienced exactly the same thing as well, where there's an unintended consequence, of the choices you make, and actually you end up with value erosion as a result of a cost reduction. And I'm sure many of us have seen exactly the same thing. It becomes, headcount is a really interesting one because you can see it on the line in the general ledger, and it's really easy to say, how do I reduce that? Rather than thinking of the value which that cost generates in the business. And I'll touch a little bit on that in a couple of slides' time, because there's a piece for me around how do you create enough agility in your plan, but also how do you test and learn in a way in which enables you to change course dependent on the circumstances that play out. But I think it's absolutely something that I recognize, as is the positive things that we talked about within Ecolab. I think one of the things which I've certainly learned is piloting activity, trialing it, testing and learning it to be in a practical way, and then being able to understand how you share that and scale it across the business and really test the value delivery becomes key. But doing a pilot, for me in one site when I've got 190, and then understanding how I scale it becomes a real challenge. But I think the principle of how you demonstrate it practically, share the learnings, and then create momentum, I think is something which, for me, has been a real unlock to the transformation programs which have been driving. It's not, it's not a guaranteed solution, but it certainly helps. Yes.
I think it's also around failure being seen as positive and use of metrics. So everybody wants to be successful. The pressure is to prove that what you're doing is successful. People use metrics which are questionable in what the hell they're measuring. So in this example, you have a candidate profile, which is somebody with with certain qualifications, certain capabilities theoretically. They may or may not have the experience. You know, I work in sustainability. I've seen sustainability teams offshored, but then they have to bring in the people that used to work in the team that have been made redundant as consultants because the new team can't actually deliver what the team was delivering before. And you could choose the metrics that made it look like a really good positive story because you've reduced you've reduced the cost, you've reduced the headcount. The fact those people do not know how to do the job, nothing against them at all.
Agree.
They may do in 5 years' time, but I think there's culture has changed, and you need a business culture where failure is actually seen positively, because otherwise no one fails, and therefore the failures are hidden, and the numbers which you're measuring are the wrong numbers. They're not the true numbers, because you can't always measure the real stuff.
Absolutely, and as I said, we'll touch on that in a few minutes, which is how do you encourage taking risks, but then also how do you adapt quickly in the event of those risks not playing out in your favor? And because if you're safe, the time it's going to take you to transform means that by the time you get there, life's moved on, and you're still one step behind. So I think we've got a couple.
I'm from Diageo. I want to ask maybe an unpopular question in this setting and for this subject, but I wanted to check with you what's your perspective on how we can minimize the number of so-called transformations. Maybe going back to your original example of number of factories that they are there in the system, by setting the supply chain right first time or within the first transformation that we are doing. Any other ideas? Because I keep hearing transformation here and transformation there, which generates another question: what do you really call a transformation? But first question to really ask, and with a request to answer, is what are your thoughts about minimizing the number of transformations?
I think, like or not, supply chain transformation is just a buzzword. You have certainly from my experience, the path that you want to take your supply chain on and your business on within the ecosystem you're operating in, you don't have a transformation and then you stop. It becomes an evolution of the business, and understanding the sequencing of what initiatives need to happen in what order, to be able to unlock the greatest amount of value is, for me, what's important, because you will never end up with a perfect value chain. You have to make progress. But what I do think is important is how you sequence the initiatives so that you get layered benefits from them. But you will never, to the point you made earlier on, you will never get that, in my experience, perfectly right. And it's how do you learn from that? But it's how do you focus on the projects and the initiatives and the sequencing of them, and what value do each of them drive, especially when they're all layered together, is certainly what I focus on. And I'm not saying that that's the ideal way of approaching it, but it's certainly something which I've experienced some success in.
I think transformation is possibly the most abused word.
I
think because I think people need to understand what is really a transformation. From my perspective, transformation is where you are really doing a step change in terms of where you are to where you are wanting to be. Otherwise, it just becomes a continuous improvement exercise, right? If you're just making incremental changes, it's not transformation. But I think people confuse that. I think to your point, in terms of how to reduce it, I don't know the answer, but I think one of the pieces which I've seen is to have an alignment within cross-functional alignment. So I'll give you an example of what we very recently found out. So we had appointed one of the big four consultants, the sales team had appointed. So there is something called a sales ops team. So they went in and they said, sales ops team can reduce 150 headcount. Why? Because the sales ops team is also doing procurement ops stuff, which should not be, it's not sales ops. So go ahead. And they went and reported. And then it comes to me from a procurement side, Milind, take over the work. I'm like, okay, if I have to take over the work, I need to hire more people. I just can't do it. So I have to, so one side of the business is showing headcount reduction or productivity or efficiency.
Completely.
And then on the other side, I'm like, I don't have the people. I mean, I don't have a magic wand that I'll just take over all the work. So that's the biggest thing. If there is no alignment or cross-functional alignment in terms of the transformation, then it's a recipe for disaster.
But I think that really plays actually to this, which is don't shortcut business alignment. You know, this is too frequently done in terms of getting both alignment, but also the business helping you to fine-tune your plans and how it helps you can help them fine-tune theirs, because it becomes part of a broader ecosystem of benefit and value delivery. And I think as part of that, you know, one of the things I've really learned is whilst you're doing that, be really clear on the impact that you want from your own business, you know, and the ownership you take yourself, and the role which external partners play in helping you do that. You know, I've seen far too many times outsourcing of ownership of change to third parties, whether that's, you know, system providers, whether it's management consultants, whether it's 3PLs. And ultimately, you want value to be achieved from this, but you need to retain ownership and control of your transformation plan. And at the same time, doing that in combination, both within the different functional areas in the business, but also vertically through your own function. So that, to the point I made earlier on, you have complete buy-in all the way from the front line, all the way to the CEO. And this is, you know, for me, you can do all the best plan in the world, but if you can't align that plan and get the right resources in place to deliver it, it's no plan at all. And I think this is especially important, you know, when you look at when we talk about system implementations, elements like that, because, you know, all the nice, sexiest systems in the world are great, but if you don't integrate that into your business way of working, both in your own function, but also with the functions around you, you will not deliver that benefit. And those external partners are primarily there for one reason. They're not there to be able to go and, you know, help you with your value delivery, even though that's, you know, interesting to them. They're there to sell your product. You know, either they're selling you, you know, their resource, their expertise, or they're selling you, you know, something physical which you're able to use. So really think about that. And I think once you have that business alignment, I think the key, which certainly I've learned in the execution, is how do you keep your plan as agile as possible, but also how do you, as I say, spend as you save? How do you variabilize your investment, and how do you phase your benefits in a way where you are funding your own investment? It is so much easier to drive transformation if you are able to fund it and pay for it yourself. And how do you then from there provide the agility that you were talking about earlier on to be able to take different paths and different routes without putting huge amounts of fixed cost or change into the business? And I don't know if that resonates with anyone in the room.
Thank you. I've been in environments where you do reinvest your savings, and it's so much easier. I'd really agree with Ben. If you've got an agreement with the business that you can reinvest a percentage of what you've saved, whereas other places I've worked, you don't have that agreement. So it's like you're all focused on what you're doing today, and you're not focused on the next thing yet, because it takes so much effort to align the business to the next thing you want to do. Yeah. So it's like watching my 7-year-old play football. Everyone's chasing the ball, and no one's looking at where they should be in 20 seconds' time. And it just makes it so much slower. So, yeah, absolutely. If you can get that into your strategy.
Yeah, and it's not always possible to do that, but it's doing it as much as you possibly can. And I think, you know, the more modular you make your solutions, the more that you phase them and sequence them, in a sensible way, and the way that you variabilize your investment as well as the benefits enables you to have that flexibility. But it builds momentum and it builds credibility. And the more that you build that, the more that you can even then justify and deliver more change. And I think the final thing for me is about benefit realization. And too often you have a change program, and at the end of it, you look at your cost to serve, or you look at your gross margin, and you look and say, well, it hasn't even moved at all. So what's been the true value of that? And it's how do you sensibly be able to track and understand your value delivery, and how do you be absolutely singularly focused in delivering it? And if you aren't, how do you change course? Yeah, so that then you can, and how do you adapt your plans to suit? So I think, this isn't, a lot of this is not rocket science, to be honest, and I'm sure it's the things which all of us consider, every time we're driving any kind of even small change program or, complex, multifaceted transformation program. But it may not apply to every business, and every change which you guys are driving. But it's maybe something which can help you in the back of your mind think about, what is the way that we're going to approach creating value in our ecosystem, not in anyone else's, but doing that in a way in which the business is aligned in as flexible and as agile a way as possible. Because the only thing you ever know is in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years' time, your business, your supply chain, the market is likely to be different. So I don't know if anyone's got any further reflections. Cool.
I think one of the pieces I think you briefly touched upon is, which is very important, is for sustainable value realization is the change management program, right? Along with all this transformation, because if you don't have the right change management program or initiative in place, these will be like short-term gains, and then it will die its natural death. So supporting all of this with the right change management program is very critical to have sustainable benefits. Otherwise, the effort is like a project, and then it just vanishes.
Yeah. And I think, to your point, is it's not just the change management through the change itself. It's how do you then make sure that you have the right governance and control in place to embed it long term. It's really easy for people, ourselves included. It happens at home all the time. My wife constantly gives me feedback about it. She asks me to do something, I'll do it for about 2 days, and then I'll just go back to doing what I used to do before. And I think it's human nature, and it's how do you keep that support in place, but also how do you also create the governance and policing to ensure that change is sustained and embedded. Okay.
Thanks, Ben. It really hits me what you're saying, and I agree with the majority of it, but I'm curious on your opinion, because when you do a bigger transformation, I have been experiencing that you really have to have a compelling, visionary, ambitious, big story about the benefits. Otherwise, you don't get stakeholders on board, you don't get the financing, etc. And there's often more ambition in there than maybe always practical. But on the other hand, you got the users, and the users, they don't really buy into the fancy stuff. They are more worried, they are more focused on the practical solutions, on the little steps, and they will have listened to your big visionary story, and whenever things don't work from the first day, they will be frustrated and they will say, they told us we get a Ferrari and this is not even a Skoda.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so how do you manage that?
I think it's actually interesting from a cultural perspective, because I think some businesses, when you sell the benefits, actually the level of ambition that you commit to delivering because it's a commitment in essence. For conservative businesses, pushing that commitment too far actually drives the wrong behavior and actually can really turn the business off, to the change which you want to drive. So it's but at the same time, if you're too conservative, clearly then you can't get the momentum behind the change that you want to drive. And I think being able to assess in your business what is the right balance to strike is really important. I think every business is slightly different there. For me currently in my business, over-promising is the worst possible thing I could do, because then everyone's super skeptical all the way through the organization. But so I think there's no one size fits all, but being able to demonstrate it practically makes a real difference, because then I think people can buy into it. But as I said, I think that will be a challenge we're always going to face. Cool. Okay, well, thank you very much, guys. I hope you enjoyed it.